The loss and damage lobby is notching up a win coming out of the recently concluded COP27 as countries participating in this year's climate change conference finally agreed to establish a funding mechanism that would compensate vulnerable nations devastated by climate-enhanced natural disasters. Advocates have been clamoring for such a mechanism for at least 2 decades, starting with the 1992 Rio Earth Summit and escalating into a constant drumbeat over the years until now, when almost every address by the leader of a vulnerable nation made loss and damage funding a leitmotif at this year's COP. While the belated agreement to establish the Loss and Damage Fund has been welcomed by many, others remain skeptical, noting that several ostentatious promises in the past have not made it to an operational stage. The 2015 Paris Agreement, for example, was supposed to have signaled the serious intention of developed countries to provide technical assistance with addressing loss, but the annual target for funding has never subsequently been met. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, in a video message issued from the conference venue, expressed hope that this new agreement, though it is, quote, not enough, can engender a sense of trust among the countries experiencing the worst effects of climate change.
From the beginning, this conference has been driven by two overriding themes: justice and ambition. Justice for those on the front lines who did so little to cause the crisis, including the victims of the recent floods in Pakistan that inundated 1/3 of the country. Ambition to keep the 1.5-degree goal alive and pull humanity back from the climate cliff. This COP has taken an important step towards justice. I welcome the decision to establish a loss and damage fund and to operationalize it in the coming period. Clearly, this will not be enough, but it is a much-needed political signal to rebuild broken trust.
Despite the accolades and approbation regarding the establishment of the fund, it is not yet a fait accompli. The only agreement thus far is about the existence of a funding mechanism to address loss and damage. Yet to be hammered out is how the finance should be provided and where it should come from. Guterres noted that without money in the fund, it will simply become yet another empty promise. He said agreement is one thing, but action is now needed given the direction the world is heading.
Justice should also mean several other things. Finally making good on the long-delayed promise of $100 billion a year in climate finance for developing countries. Clarity and a credible roadmap to double adaptation finance. Changing the business models of multilateral development banks and international financial institutions. They must accept more risk and systematically leverage private finance for developing countries at reasonable costs. But let's be clear, our planet is still in the emergency room. We need to drastically reduce emissions now, and this is an issue this COP did not address. A fund for loss and damage is essential, but it's not an answer if the climate crisis washes a small island state off the map or turns an entire African country to desert.
The Secretary-General reiterated the call for the world to lower its emissions levels and make better climate-smart choices.
To have any hope of keeping to 1.5, we need to massively invest in renewables and end our addiction to fossil fuels. We must avoid an energy scramble in which developing countries finish last, as they did in the race for COVID-19 vaccines. Doubling down on fossil fuels is double trouble. The Just Energy Transition partnerships are important pathways to accelerate the phasing out of coal and scaling up renewables. But we need much more. That is why I am pushing so hard for a climate solidarity pact. A pact in which all countries make an extra effort to reduce emissions this decade in line with 1.5-degree goal. A pact to mobilize, together with the international financial institutions and the private sector, financial and technical support for large emerging economies to accelerate their renewable energy transition. This is essential to keep the 1.5-degree limit within reach and for everyone to play their part.
Simon Steele, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, had a positive outlook, saying during his closing remarks at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt that the world had finally determined a way forward in addressing a conversation on funding for loss and damage, which has been ongoing for years. Countries suffering loss and damage can access a matchmaking service to the organizations willing to provide support through the Santiago network agreed upon at COP25 in Madrid, but only established this year. The Santiago network will consist of a secretariat to facilitate its work, an advisory board to provide guidance and oversight to the secretariat to ensure its effective functioning, and a network of member organizations and persons to examine a spectrum of topics relating to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. Another first-time proposal this year was to reform global financial systems in order to take into consideration the $4 to $6 trillion that are needed annually up to 2030 for investment in renewable energy projects. This money is needed to transform countries into low-carbon economies with a goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. The global financial reform proposal includes driving engagement from world governments, central banks, commercial banks, institutional investors, and multilateral financial institutions. COP27 also concluded with the, quote, human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment being embedded into the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the first time this right is referenced in any international environmental negotiations. The development comes amid medical professionals increasingly making more direct linkages between global heating and negative public health outcomes. The triumphs of COP27 have been accompanied by some disappointments, including the failed attempts by some countries led by India to receive support for a global phase-down on all fossil fuels, not just coal, as was agreed during last year's COP26 in Glasgow.